Greetings and peace. I would like to start this with Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Peace be with you and yours. Today's presentation, I would like to discuss the teachings of Rudolf Steiner and the parallel comparisons that I have found with Eastern mysticism, particularly Islam, Sufism. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy. Disclaimer: this presentation is produced for the purposes of entertainment, free speech, and fair use. It is a critical educational work designed to analyze and evaluate the ideas, writings, and legacy of Rudolf Steiner, the Anthroposophical movement, and related traditions. And all of the quotations, references, and paraphrases are presented for scholarly critique, historical examination, and the promotion of intellectual honesty. This work and presentation aims to dismantle harmful myths and expose racial and supremacist ideologies embedded in certain strands of the Western esoteric system. The approach here is being unapologetic, direct, not to defame, but to shine light on ideas that have too long been sheltered from scrutiny under the guise of spirituality or culture. And those of you that have followed my work, whether it's Freemasonry or other stuff that I have critiqued from the Western esoteric perspective, I'm always fair, and in this one I will be also. Now let's look at the context and background. Rudolf Steiner, born 1861, died in 1925, was an Austrian philosopher, educator, and esotericist who founded Anthroposophy, a spiritual movement claiming to unite science, art, and spirituality. His ideas informed the Waldorf education system, biodynamic farming, and alternative medicine. Yet Steiner's worldview emerged in the same cultural soil that nourished European colonialism and racial theory. The esoteric revival of the late 19th and 20th centuries, whether it's Theosophy, spiritualism, Rosicrucianism, often carried embedded hierarchies, placing the European, especially the quote-unquote Aryan, as the pinnacle of human evolution. While Steiner incorporated material from Islamic and Eastern traditions, these were reframed to fit his own Eurocentric evolutionary schema. Here we have the Krishnamurti scenario, where one of the clearest examples of Steiner's racial attitudes is his dismissal of Jiddu Krishnamurti, the young Indian whom Theosophists hailed as a world teacher. Steiner referred to him dismissively as a quote-unquote Hindu lad, and doubted that someone from India could fulfill such a spiritual role. This was rooted in Steiner's belief that the Aryan European cultural epoch represented the highest stage of human spiritual development, and that Asian civilizations were spiritually in decline. The critics note that this view was consistent with both contemporary theosophical racial theory and broader colonial prejudice of the time. Now, Steiner's work contains numerous references to a spiritual hierarchy of races. He wrote that a race or nation stands so much the higher, the more perfectly its members express the pure ideal human type, a statement consistent with early 20th century racial anthropology. He described some races as flowering while others were degenerating, suggesting an evolutionary process in which higher races were designed to lead. While the Anthroposophy followers, have debated the interpretation of these remarks, commissions in Europe have acknowledged that many such statements by contemporary legal standards are discriminatory. Now we look at the anthroposophical defense versus the critics. Defenders of Steiner often claim his racial comments must be understood in the context of reincarnation and spiritual evolution, not biology. They argue he taught that any soul could incarnate in any race over lifetimes. Critics counter that regardless of metaphysics, Steiner still mapped racial groups to fixed positions on a spiritual hierarchy, reinforcing the colonial era stereotypes. Investigations in the Netherlands found 16 blatantly discriminatory statements in Steiner's collected works, with 67 more considered ambiguous but potentially problematic. Now, Islam has an intellectual legacy in Europe. Islamic thought profoundly shaped European philosophy, science, and spirituality. Medieval translations of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Averroes, Al-Ghazali into Latin informed scholasticism and later Enlightenment thought. Sufi mysticism, particularly figures like Rumi and Ibn Arabi, offered symbolic and experimental frameworks that fascinated European esotericists. Elements of Islamic architecture, symbolism, and guild organization entered European esoteric orders, though often detached from their Islamic theological roots, which I have covered, right? The Islamic origins of Thelema, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, the Moorish presence in Spain, and how that presence in Al-Andalus was able to bring Europe out of darkness with the Catholic Church into light. So all of that is there. It's not only Steiner's group and movement, but any Western esoteric order never talks about the East or gives the East any credit. I've seen this time and time again, as much as they claim to be enlightened and love and light for everyone. So that's where I came in. So, that's how it is. So Steiner worked in a context where Islamic sources were already filtered through Oriental scholarship, admired but subordinated to a European narrative of progress. We look at Fatwa, Al-Fatwa, the spiritual chivalry. Al-Fatwa, or Islamic spiritual chivalry, is a code of moral conduct rooted in humility, courage, and service to others. Now, emerging from Quranic principles and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Fatwa orders trained members not only in physical skills but in inner purifications. This holistic ethical training parallels Waldorf's emphasis on moral and artistic education, though in Waldorf it is reframed through the anthroposophical cosmology rather than Islamic spirituality. And it's like even if you look at the Demolay symbol, right, in Freemasonry, it has the Islamic crescent star and moon, and how the Knights Templars and Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Thelema, all of it has Islamic origins. But we see that even those orders of chivalry were introduced into Europe during the time of the Crusades. Now we look at Islamic pedagogy and Waldorf, where traditional Islamic education, from madrasas to Sufi lodges, addressed the whole human being with stages of intellectual, moral, and spiritual growth. Teachers modeled ethical conduct, and learning was often in a dialogue perspective and circles of discourse. Waldorf's staged developmental approach mirrors this holistic structure, though its religious foundation is Anthroposophy rather than Islam. In Steiner's esotericism, the guardian of the threshold is a spiritual being who confronts the seeker at the boundary between ordinary consciousness and higher worlds. It functions as a moral and spiritual test, revealing the seeker's unresolved faults before deeper initiation can proceed. In Islamic perspective, we have Munkar and Nakir, right, the grave questioners. And in Islamic eschatology and teachings, the angels Munkar and Nakir question the soul in the grave, testing faith and deeds before the soul's journey continues. The parallels with Steiner's guardian lies in the threshold function, where both serve as gatekeepers and revealers of truth about the soul's readiness for the next stage of existence, and how in Islamic teachings they tell us that your eyes, your hands, your feet, your consciousness, the shadow being attached to you, right? Egregores, all that stuff will testify against you in a way, right? And that's that concept of the quote-unquote guardian of the threshold. It predates Anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner, and it exists already in Islamic cosmology and teachings. The afterlife journeys. Steiner described post-death experiences involving stages of purification and review, moving through spiritual realms. Islamic teachings describe the barzakh, an intermediate realm between death and resurrection, where the soul awaits judgment. Both traditions emphasize moral accountability and the soul's preparation for ultimate destiny. Steiner's eschatology envisions a future war of all against all, a period of total social collapse and moral disintegration preceding spiritual renewal. This concept resonates with the Islamic notion of fitna, times of trial and civil strife before the end, culminating in the emergence of Yajuj and Majuj, Gog and Magog. Waldorf education uses symbolic art, color, and geometry to shape consciousness. Sufi art also employs geometry, rhythm, and symbolism, but in service to the remembrance of God, in Islamic art and calligraphy. While both use beauty to shape the soul, their metaphysical frameworks differ radically. René Guénon, a French traditionalist who converted to Islam, criticized Anthroposophy as a counter-tradition, a distortion of authentic esoteric principles. He saw in movements like Steiner's an appropriation and inversion of traditional symbols, sometimes in service to modernist or nationalist agendas. Now, Steiner's use of non-European traditions illustrates a broader pattern of spiritual colonialism, borrowing from other cultures while subordinating them to a European spiritual hierarchy. This mirrors the dynamics of political colonialism, where resources are extracted but the source culture is marginalized or redefined as less evolved. I'm making this presentation because Steiner has made statements calling Islam as a Luciferic Ahrimanic force, right? Which is not true. If you study Sufi mysticism, Islamic mysticism, the sciences, the teachings on how we're all supposed to be one human family, it's not like that. And how Islam has a huge impact on the European Renaissance, what we're dealing with in the concept of bringing Europe out of darkness, heavily influencing Knights Templars, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Thelema, all these orders. So, and even Theosophy, right? Madame Blavatsky, her teacher, Jamal al-Afghani, who she referred to as Serapis Bey, was a Sufi master and Freemason. So even Theosophy has Eastern roots and traditions. Now, what is the response of modern-day Waldorf? Some Waldorf schools today attempt to address the racist aspects of Steiner's legacy, introducing diversity and anti-bias training. However, the foundational texts remain, and critics argue that without critical engagement, these racial hierarchies persist in subtle ways. It's like in the Masonic community, right? You have all of these Albert Pike apologists who said, oh, he was despite his racist past, he had a change of heart and he started helping the Native Americans and things like that. But the stuff that he said cannot be erased. So Steiner fits that same category. Islamic influences on Steiner are real but reframed within his Eurocentric spiritual evolution model. To decolonize esoteric education, it is necessary to acknowledge and challenge these embedded hierarchies, restoring the integrity and context of the traditions from which such ideas were borrowed. And all of this stuff, all of these occult and esoteric orders, they all have huge Eastern origins and influences, yet they never talk about the East or give the East any credit, whether it's the Masonic world, the esoteric world, or anything in general. Even if you look at the so-called the exposés that they do, or the expos that they do, right? At the speaking panels, the speakers, it's always the same faces. You don't see any diversity in faces or topics, and yet these people claim to be enlightened and love and light. So no, I don't buy into that. And that's where even in the Masonic world, I hit them hard and put my own stuff out there in terms of books and lectures, whether they like it or not. Now here are the references that you can view at your leisure, convenience, and pleasure, and you can check this out. Thank you for watching, and again, if any questions or comments, please email me at salmanshake911@gmail.com. And again, this work whether it's the images, information, critiques, investigative purposes, education purposes. It's all protected under the laws of free speech and the copyright laws of fair use for nonprofit and education purposes. Thank you so much. All rights reserved.